of a Dram and a Drush, where the waters of life meet the tree of life. And this month, I'm delighted that my guest is Rabbi Drew Kaplan. Rabbi Drew is the Director of Pastoral Care and Jewish Life at the Majestic Care of Cedar Village in Mason, Ohio. Prior to working there, he has spent extensive time working with students and young adults, first of all in Southern California and then in the Cincinnati area, helping to grow and develop modern Orthodox Jewish life. He's a graduate of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah in New York City, a modern Orthodox yeshiva, and we have connected through our shared fellowship in the Rabbis Without Borders Fellows of Klal. Rabbi Drew is the author of a couple of books. They include Talmudic Musings, 50 essays on Talmudic terms, ideas, and more, and Power at 30 essays on early rabbinic literature, which was something that he did as a product of his study in his 30s. He's now working on the next volume for the next decade. Rabbi Drew is certainly somebody who enjoys a good dram of whiskey, but he's in fact interested in all aspects of Jewish drinking and Jewish drinks and Jews who drink and Jews involved in the creation of drinks. You can find out about all of his incredible plethora of knowledge and information at his website, jewishdrinking.com, and on his podcast, The Jewish Drinking Show, which has now recorded more than 110 episodes. He has interviewed people of all kinds on all aspects of Jewish drinking, and I highly commend his fantastic podcast to you. So today, I'm really privileged to have him as a guest on my podcast. I have a little ways to go before I can catch up with him, but we welcome Rabbi Drew Kaplan. So, Drew, it is wonderful to have you here on a Dram and a Drush. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's grateful to be. I'm excited to be had.
And let's jump right in. You have a dram for us today. Tell us, what is your dram and why did you choose it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I've got our Begui BC here, and it is, first of all, L'chaim. What are you drinking?
So I'm drinking something from Isla, just a little bit down the road, but actually on the very same strip of the island, a little bit of Lefroy. So I'm joining you in the smoky, peaty department, but just a little bit different.
All right, L'chaim.
L'chaim, so, cheers.
All right, so we Beastie, I was introduced to it March 2021. And the story behind why I chose this, even though I've liked whiskeys, had whiskeys, but for me, I moved to Cincinnati 4 years ago, and I wouldn't really drink on Saturdays, which is a strange thing for a Jewish drinker to say. I am typically dry on Saturdays, but when I moved to Cincinnati, I knew that, Kiddushes, people drink, so I would drink on Saturdays. When the pandemic hit March 2020, for me, it was a break. It was an opportunity to go dry again on Saturdays, and I stayed that way. Although there was a guy in the neighborhood who held kiddushes. Even summer 2020, he held kiddushes out on his front lawn. Even when shul wasn't going on, he was still having kiddushes, and he has a great taste in whiskeys and wines, a lot of good stuff. And it's funny because even though I live right near Kentucky, he refuses to drink bourbon. He only drinks scotch. And so which, I'm sure you can appreciate. So, and I would even encounter people on the street. Oh, you got to check out the Kiddush. We opened this bottle and that bottle. And I really, even October 2020, really wanted to go. Finally, after both my wife and I got our vaccination shots, she allowed me to return to shul March 2020 or 2021, and I was very excited. And so that very first Shabbos morning of returning to shul, what does one do? Go to the outdoor kiddush. And so I went, and while there, I encountered this. Now, I'd had other whiskeys there, but this was entirely new, and it was so fascinating. Look, it's only 5 years old, which for a scotch, that's pretty young, and yet it is really approachable, really even for an Isla. So it's full of flavor. It's got such an incredible mixture of course, we talked about smoke. You're having Lefroy, and yet there's a sweetness, a youthfulness to it. it doesn't take itself too seriously, and it really is just a wonderful combination of all these things. I mean, funnily enough, it is quite sweet, but it look, it's got a really lovely balance, and it's very approachable. So for me, it's kind of the story of the last couple of years of coming out of being isolated and returning to kiddishes. So that's and I forgot to mention the best part. It's only about $50, which.
So a 5-year Ardbeg. Ardbeg has an incredible history, been around for over 200 years. And I know as a distillery, a lot of people, particularly these days, if you are familiar with whiskies like Ardbeg, as you said, like they have whiskies that cost an awful lot more. They have something called the committee, and every year there's a committee release. And so those things tend to, they're available and then they're not. And if you get one, great. And then after that, if you want another one, as I discovered with the bottle I have behind me, Ardbeg Kelpie, not so easy and very expensive. And I don't know about you, Drew, but I buy whiskey not to collect. I buy it to drink, over time, in suitable amounts, but I'm not buying as a collector per se. At the end of my life, I don't want to be looking at walls of beautiful brown liquid that I didn't get to enjoy. I don't know if you have a philosophy about that when it comes to whiskey.
So I buy to drink, but it really sets up a stark contrast from a couple of my neighbors. My immediate neighbor, he'll even buy stuff off of the secondary market for whiskeys. He's really bourbon centric, but he'll have some scotches around for the scotch drinkers. He says, look, I know what they fetch on the secondary markets and all these things, but I'm here to drink. Meanwhile, another neighbor of mine down the street, he has been buying whiskeys for a decade and a half. He rarely opens them, and it's not so much for collecting, but as investment opportunities to resell whiskeys down the road, whether it's and he's been holding on for over a decade, and some of them will still be another decade more. So there's lots of different types of people interested in whiskey. Obviously, the drinkers, whether it's an investor, a collector. So there's a variety.
That's true. That's true. In fact,
that's just on my street.
And you reminded me, I met somebody, I did a baby naming a few years ago. I think this was pre-COVID. And the guy had the entire Game of Thrones whiskey collection. For those who don't know, there was a period where different whiskey companies were asked to, for the different houses in the Game of Thrones, they brought out these whiskeys and they were on the top shelf. He's never going to open them. And he brought them, he bought them. He said, one day I hope this will pay for my kids' college education.
So first of all, I had the Johnny Walker, the White Walker, right? The Snow Walker from the last season. I had that with a neighbor, but I actually have been telling the neighbor who I was telling who invests, I said, he's got a closet underneath his stairs. I just say that's his kid's college fund right there, all those whiskeys.
Absolutely.
It could be college fund investments.
So, Drew, I'm going to move to a little bit of a drash here. Well, your drash, really, the story of why you are here today. Your day job, you are a director of pastoral care, Jewish life at a senior living facility. But you are also the producer now of over 110 episodes of the Jewish Drinking Show. And when I was looking to launch this podcast, which has rather fewer episodes than you have under your belt, a little newer to this game, everybody said, you got to talk to Drew. If you want to do a podcast about things that are Jewish and drinking, go to Drew.
Awesome.
And so what's the story? How did you get into this subject? How did you end up launching the Jewish Drinking Show, which of course is not just about whiskey, it's about beer and wine and actually all kinds of things to do with the industry, to do with the experience. And even I know you've had one of our colleagues in to talk about those who need to abstain from alcohol and sort of the sort of awareness of supporting people in recovery. And so it's really across the board what you've covered. So tell us the story.
Absolutely. So there's lots of stories. There's little stories as well. I will say, so back in late 2018, I was really thinking I didn't have an outlet for a lot of my textual stuff. One of the things that I enjoy almost most about being a rabbi was really sharing textual thoughts. And so finally I decided January 1, 2019, I would launch a site where I would share my thoughts on texts of whether it's Talmudic, whether it's halachic, whether it's Tanakh. I love those Jewish texts, or certainly those genres of Jewish literature. So I started, and I published on a fairly somewhat regular basis. And I finally realized summer 2019, wait a second, I'm really just publishing in 3 areas. What an opportunity that I lost. Especially, I would say of those 3 areas, the one highest was really about drinking in Jewish tradition. And it was a pretty blandly titled website. And, I really was just kicking myself. What a lost opportunity, until I came across late August 2019, Gary Vaynerchuk, who actually, while he is a Jew, I don't think people think of him in Jewish spaces, but I would say he's probably the most famous wine merchant in American history. So there's like this Jewish wine connection, but really of niching down. So finally, September 10th, I bought jewishdrinking.com and decided to move a lot of the blog content over. And even though I initially considered it as really just sharing Jewish content about these items, someone said, look, it just became apparent, video podcasts really just need to happen, especially to bring on guests who are outside of my area, whether it's history, whether it's Kabbalah. There's lots of things when it relates to Jewish drinking that are way outside of anything that I could share. So that's really how it started. Of course, with anything, there's a little bit more to the story. I mean, why did I write those things on my textual perspectives? Really because I was dissatisfied with the general Jewish discourse around drinking, whether biblically, whether Talmudically, or onward. So I think it came with a great dissatisfaction around these things that prompted me to really try to inject into a Jewish discourse around these topics, because I don't think a lot of it's healthy. And so you mentioned I've actually had some guests on talking about abstention from alcohol or alcohol abuse, and that's true, because I think that needs to be part of the story. In fact, when I posted on Facebook, when I launched this September 10th, I had people saying, but what about people who abuse alcohol? Like, what messaging are you sending? So I knew immediately I needed to create a page on the website to talk about that. And just like with the story of Noah, the first ever drinking instance in the entirety of Tanakh and the Jewish Bible in Genesis 9, that there's sort of like this opposite end, right? Obviously, there's this levity, a good aspect to drinking, but there could be a not so good side. So I think that absolutely needs to be part of the drinking discourse when it comes to Judaism. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's the nutshell version.
Well, we can get into some of the details as well, because there's over 110 episodes. I have not yet caught up on all of them, as I'm relatively late to the game here, but I have dipped into many of them, and I have learned so much, and awesome. It's really been fascinating. The things that I didn't know about wine. There was one episode I absolutely loved in the wine area, actually, that was explaining something about these different grape varieties growing in Israel, and things that are sort of more that trying to, as opposed to those who came over from Europe and planted European and French grape varieties, that's sort of the search now to create something that's a more distinctive set of varieties that are based on things that have a much longer history in Israel, for example. I just thought that was a fascinating episode.
Yeah, so mid-19th century, Sir Moses Montefiore comes and says, we got to start making wine again. This is because Israel had been a sort of a dead country for winemaking since the Muslim conquest. And really, there was no wine being produced. So when he said in the mid-19th century, we got to do this. So they brought over grapevines from the greatest wine country in the world, France. So they brought them over imported. And so, like you mentioned, there's been a recent push to try to figure out what the native varietals are of what really should be growing well with the terroir of Israel. So it's, yeah.
Yeah. And in the whiskey world, actually, I'm talking about Israel. Israel's doing some interesting things, and I know you've had some of those guests on as well. So some of the highlights, if people are looking around, trying to find some of the wonderful interviews you've had, what have you discovered about the whiskey world of Israel?
So that's something I'm still discovering. There's Milk and Honey, Golani, Thinkers. There's some distilleries now popping up. Look, I mean, it's hard to argue with Israel being a wine. This is an utterly facile and really sort of a flat way of looking at the world, but one can. It's an interesting lens to look at the world in terms of lands or countries and what they drink, right? So Israel always has been and probably always will be a wine drinking country. Beer and whiskey taking a second seat. Meanwhile, of course, for the Talmud fans out there, we know that in Bavel and Sasanian Persia, it was not a wine country. it was a beer first country. And so wine was, wine in Israel is like beer in Persia. And in America, it's hard to figure out what America is, but France, we don't think about beer in France. They are a wine country, but you go to Russia, it's vodka. And so I like to think about lands as being about what they drink largely. And so, look, they can try having whiskey. It's obviously not Kentucky or Scotland, but it's something. And beer will always struggle in Israel, although I want it to grow because I'm a beer lover. So, but I am a pluralist, so I'll drink whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what they're doing and what the influences are. I've spent some time learning a little bit about Milk and Honey and their story, and most recently, and something that I hope to look forward to finding out more about for maybe a future episode down the road, is there's a brand new American-style whiskey that has just started to be made in Israel called Slingshot. That is, they can't call it bourbon because bourbon is a distinctly American designation. They're going with Kentucky style, which is interesting because it's clearly not from Kentucky either. But I think it's a way to indicate to Israelis primarily that this is a corn-based whiskey, with at least 51% corn. So that's, but it's not, they don't have to follow American rules. So they're not using brand new charred oak barrels, the way bourbon is made in America. They are using, of course, what's available and affordable in Israel, ex-wine barrels that they are then like doing extra charring to in order to make this whiskey. So it's an interesting world. It's an interesting world as things get picked up and we become more globalized in some of the things, the influences. But I want to come back. You said, what is America? I'm really intrigued by the story you told before about the kiddushes, which, is something that within Reform Judaism is less common. I mean, there's kiddush, there's an oneg, but the idea of whiskey being present at an oneg, I grew up with that. Modern Orthodox synagogue in the UK, but it's not something that you typically find in most Reform synagogues. I'm the bringer of whiskey experiences every now and again to my congregation, but whiskey is such an American Jewish thing, especially among more Orthodox men. What's your take on that? Why has that become part of the culture here?
It is a curious thing, and it tends to be very Scotch centric. And even though America's whiskey is bourbon, and even though I am an 18-minute drive away from Bourbon Land, still Scotch reigns supreme. And there might be, I don't know if it's necessarily a flavor thing or it might be a money thing. I know certainly in the New York area, they valorize Scotch and especially pricey Scotches. So there's something around that. I can't put my finger on it exactly, but there's, I did do a Kiddush Club episode. So there is this thing known as Kiddush Clubs. And for your listeners who are perhaps less familiar with it, it's something that is not necessarily done at the regular Kiddush. It's actually something done while the Haftarah is being read and maybe some of the rabbi's speech. So it's people going off and then consuming Scotch and perhaps some herring, and then coming back in for Musaf. So I don't know that that's necessarily beyond Orthodox circles, but certainly I can tell you that there are a lot of Orthodox rabbis who hate it and detest it and want to get rid of it, and yet it persists. So it's there. It's funny when we talk about kiddushes, because one of the episodes I had, a strange spot actually, was talking about binge drinking amongst teenagers, amongst high school students. So there was a guest who she herself didn't drink, but she said, look, you can try to quash kiddushes wherever they're taking, even if you were to say, let's have it as a shul, we're not going to have a kiddush. But I like to think about Jurassic Park, where we say life finds a way. I would say kiddush finds a way. So even if it's kind of like whack-a-mole. Even if you stop a kiddush here, kiddush is going to pop up. So it might be a cultural thing, phenomenon that happens. Just, getting together. It's funny because even when we go back to the Talmud, the main kiddush is actually supposed to be Friday night. And then they have, in a much later generation, this Kiddush Rabbah, this great kiddush happening. And yet that has what is sort of persisted as sort of, when we think of kiddush, that's where kiddush takes place, or at least in a more communal, certainly a shul setting.
Right. Right. And you mentioned the sources. I think one of the things that is really interesting is because of your background and the study you've done and your research in Talmudic texts, is that the Jewish texts and the halachic issues that come up with some of the, whether it's wine or whiskey, beer, all of those things, there's quite a lot of complexity there when it comes to what's halachic, and also not universal opinion as well. What is there anything where there's universal opinion? But I'm aware, I actually bought a book called Halacham Whiskey, and I'm reading like the minutiae of the debate around the way that whiskeys are finished. And there doesn't seem, from what I could glean from that there isn't one position on what, are all whiskeys kosher? Clearly not, but there are nuances depending on whose opinion you're seeking as to who will drink what kind of whiskeys. And I'm interested whether you have an opinion on that yourself, and sort of the some of the issues that come up for observant Jews who enjoy whiskey. Are there parameters as to what kind of whiskeys they can enjoy?
Rabbis with opinions disagreeing with other rabbis. What a thing. So
what a surprise.
Right. What a surprise. So A, I do have an opinion, but B, going back to what you were saying, I almost wonder if I could do a website or a podcast 100% dedicated only to Talmudic drinking topics, because there is a lot there, a lot. So much that I haven't even scratched the surface of in my content that I've published. That having been said, I don't know how wide of an audience that would find. So there's certainly plenty of people to bring in. At the same time, one of my fascinations with Talmud is it provides really the foundation, the framework for all subsequent Jewish legal discussions, the halachic discussions, as you were pointing out. And there is, as you can imagine, room for rabbinic disagreement. And one of the sort of central current day disagreements runs around what you were saying is obviously whiskey, but also beer when it's aged in wine barrels, and sort of what the status is. And going back to the Talmud, it's fine. Like the rabbis say it's fine. The Shulchan Aruch, sort of the standard Jewish code of law, is fine with it. It's only in recent times that it's really become an issue. Now, there are, surprise, rabbis who disagree with each other. So there's multiple opinions on multiple sides, and debates reign. They continue to our day. But I'm typically fine with it. I mean, I would say one of the central components is, can you have a beer or whiskey that was aged in a previously a cask, a barrel, some sort of container that previously contained Gentile wine? And then that's sort of one level. And then sort of a more recent phenomenon is also, what about sherry? Because even though sherry is a wine, some rabbis say, well, it's not just a wine, it is a fortified wine. So that's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that talking about the Israeli whiskeys, M&H, because they are trying to cater to the full breadth of opinion, have gone the extra length of actually working with a company to make explicitly kosher sherry, purely so that they could empty it out and then have the casks in order to have a sherry finish on their whiskey that would be acceptable to all. It's really interesting how
there are
they're
certain
following
advantages to being in Israel. I mean, I knew back in California someone who wanted to do wine aged beers, but they had a relationship with a kosher winery out in California, so they could easily get it. Now in Israel, you can easily get spent kosher wine barrels, but yeah, sherry is going to be a special challenge. But that's great to hear that they did that.
Right. So now, Drew, you've been at this for a while. The range of your interests are sort of picked up in all of the array of the guests that you have. Over how many years have you been recording? How many years did it take you to get over 100 episodes down?
So the little bit of the timeline, September 10th, I bought the domain for jewishdrinking.com, imported a bunch of the blog content. And then I think by October 2019, I started publishing and really just hit the ground running. I did not do the smart thing and actually think ahead and load up several recordings. I really was just trying to record, publish. And then finally, I think by the spring of 2020, I finally had some stuff in the bank of recordings, and, being able to sit on some, and always knowing that I had some to publish. So But yeah, look, I've taken some breaks, whether in the summer, winters, and obviously during various holiday seasons. But over 110 episodes now. And there are still topics I haven't even touched. I haven't even talked about the Ben Sora or Moreh, sort of the rebellious son that's in the Torah, as well as some things that we don't necessarily think about drinking, but Nazir is an interesting topic to discuss, as well as Sotah even. So there's a lot of these topics that are not abstruse, that they're even found in the Torah, that have not, I haven't even touched yet. So there's still plenty, in addition to the historic, some archaeological episodes, Kabbalistic episodes, Jewish practice episodes. I will say, when I first announced that I started talking to people fall of 2019, I'm doing this, I got questions like, how much is there even to talk about, even from rabbis? How much is there even to discuss? Like, almost like it was like a Hall of Fame of Jewish sports legends. How many Jews in sports are there, right? How much is there to talk about in drinking in Jewish life? But it turns out there's actually a lot. I mean, for me to publish over 100 episodes and feel like I've barely scratched the surface, there's still clearly a lot of content out there. And I haven't really fully thought this through, and there's probably a lot of holes in this, but my hypothesis is that drinking sort of runs through a lot of Jewish thought, text, life. I think a lot of Jewish practices especially in a lot of ways that people don't even necessarily think about. For instance, so one episode I did was wine in the Mishnah. So this early 3rd, late 2nd century text, the Mishnah, the very first Mishnah involves drinking. And when I point this out to people, they're shocked. Like, what do you mean? And I say, it's right there. That Rabban Gamliel's sons come home after a night of drinking after midnight. Like, who comes home before midnight after a night of drinking? So they come home, or really the opposite. Who comes home after midnight not drinking? So they come home, they stumble in, and they said, oh, we didn't say the Shema. And he says, oh, that's fine. You still have time, right? But where do they come from? They came from a drinking house, a Beit Mishteh.
Didn't even think about it. Yeah.
Exactly. Most people read that. It's the very first Mishnah, and drinking is right there. It's in our lives, and it's in classical Jewish texts. And we have some, of course, very famous Jewish drinking stories right there in Genesis. Of course, I mentioned Noach in chapter 9. We have Lot and his daughters in 19. But some of the things are just there and escaped under our noses without comment. So it's a lot of this. A lot of this is just part of Jewish life, Jewish history, Jewish practice, and even Kiddush and Havdalah, the way we open and close Shabbat or holidays. It's there, and we don't necessarily think about it, but it's there.
Yeah, no, for sure it is. And I think that, one of the themes, and we have our own unique flavor or way in which it shows up, but this is true for other cultures as well, is that, it's, why I'll join you, why we're chatting over Dram. There's something about, and it's not about, partying and we've talked about, we have to be careful to make sure that people understand that this is not an advert for a lot of drinking or excessive drinking. It's about appreciating and enjoying. But a dram historically was a very specific quantity, and it's a very, very small quantity. When we say pour me a wee dram, I love that the Ardbeg is called the wee beastie. It's that wee dram. It really is. It's not about how much we're drinking. It's the fact that there's something about that sharing of a drink or sharing an experience opens up connection and opens up, gathering and community and all of those other things that go with it. And so that's where the story comes from. That's the story.
Which reminds me of an earlier episode I did featuring Professor Glenn Dinner about the sort of 18th century or 19th century Polish drinking. So these Jewish tavern keepers were sort of perceived as the best in Poland. You wanted the Jews to be your tavern keepers because they could watch the products, they could serve the products, but they wouldn't necessarily consume it, and certainly not in an irresponsible way. They could maintain the products serving the customers. And curiously, not just in Jewish texts, but even in the Gentile text, they perceive everybody, both Jew and Gentile, perceive Jews as being sort of more sober, right? Not necessarily big drinkers, and the Gentiles just being, these big drinkers drinking in the taverns. But meanwhile, Jews still drank. They just happen to drink more this is the rise of Hasidim, or Hasidic movements, Hasidism. So, but they would still drink. They would just drink in these sort of closed environments, and it would be, they would drink responsibly. It was more vodka, but they would drink responsibly. They would drink together, and it was more of a controlled environment rather than just sort of a freewheeling sort of drinking session. So we've had that in our history.
So I did want to ask you, it's interesting, that perception that Jews drink responsibly, because I'm sure this has come up in other conversations you've had. And I'm really aware from having read a little bit of the history, particularly in the lead up to Prohibition, that perception of, we don't need to be completely, we don't need to prohibit, because if others did like we did and drank responsibly, we wouldn't have the kinds of problems that people are talking about, or the problems they want to solve with Prohibition. There's something a little uncomfortable about that for me. I wonder, A, was it really true in terms of Jews drinking in moderation, compared to any other ethnic or cultural group? And secondly, the sort of flip side of that was that Jews who were advocating for that, including some very famous rabbis, Rabbi Wise. These were people. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you're referencing Jews and Booze by Marnie Davis now.
Absolutely. but she lays that out. But one of the things that struck me when I read about the sermons he would give, while it still felt okay to be trying to push to save and not end up the complete prohibition route, was that there seemed to be a kind of a dark side to that, which was almost that the Jews would play into the racism of don't be like those other groups, be like us. But there are these other cultural groups or other ethnic groups that do have a reputation for misusing alcohol. And that was like the silent, unspoken part. And I find that's something I'm interested in investigating, is sort of actually looking at race and racism, anti-Semitism through the lens of that drinking history, because I think there's a lot there. But I don't know if that's something you've already entered into conversation with others and have had a chance to talk about.
Not at all. Look, in Marnie Davis's book, she talks certainly in the late 19th, but like really starkly that first decade of the 20th century, where she talks about the Atlanta stuff, the various riots that occur, that there's a lot of racial stuff going on. I haven't delved into that. There is, like you were mentioning, Rabbi Wise in the 19th century, right here in Cincinnati, talking about how the Jews can control ourselves. And, and by the way, just talking about perspectives or perceptions is even post World War II or 50s, 60s, there were articles coming out that, and I think even more recently, closer to our day, about Jews not being alcoholics and not abusing alcohol, which is, as we know, patently untrue, but yet it was a matter of perception. And so I don't know what it is. Actually, even I mentioned in Poland, right, 18th, 19th centuries, but I've even had a guest on talking about how the Jews were perceived in 18th, 19th century Jamaica. And so it was the same. And that Jews are typically considered sort of not drinking out of hand, right? That there's a more responsible aspect to it. And who knows, maybe part of it does have to do with incorporating as part of our rituals, that wine is ubiquitous and there's a certain responsibility around it. So I don't know what sort of lends itself. That might be more of an anthropological, sociological aspect, but it's certainly a fascinating. I also think that, who knows, maybe we have a healthier perspective because we don't entirely demonize it, that it is incorporated through our rituals and it's incorporated as part of our life, that we know, not like, at least we have an aspiration that it doesn't get out of hand. And right. There are still occasions, Simchat Torah and Purim being chief amongst them, in which there's certainly an elevated consumption level, but it's part of life.
Yeah, no, I think there's a bigger picture there, and as you said, it's complex. There isn't really one way to look at that. But I find that the history of that narrative to be really interesting and something that I'm looking forward to looking into a little bit more as well.
So I think drinking is such a fascinating topic when it comes to Judaism. I like to think of it as like sort of the quintessential sort of rabbinic Talmudic thing, because it demands nuance. You can't just go to one extreme or the other, neither of which are necessarily healthy or makes people happy. I think you need something in the middle with just loads and loads of nuance. And I think there's a lot to pull apart, to double click into, to explore with drinking in the Jewish tradition and life.
Right. So I have one more question for you, and I think that this may be hard to answer because it may be like asking you to choose your favorite child. Is there maybe it's not the favorite episode, maybe that's the wrong question, but is there an episode that you've recorded of the Jewish Drinking Show that really stood out for you, maybe because it surprised you or amazed you, what you learned from the exchange, from the conversation. Maybe it's her favorite. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but is there anything in particular that you'd like to say? This one really was memorable to you.
Oh, wow. It might be easier to pick a favorite child. I'm just kidding.
I said it might not be possible to answer. It might be a tough one.
The thing that I'm going to start off with, I'm just going to throw this out there. One of the earliest episodes, it wasn't even planned to record. It really was amongst the first few. I'm not necessarily saying it was the favorite, but I'll tell you why it merits this distinction. I'm happy to talk about a few others. But so my favorite book in the entirety of, actually, no, before I get there. So I was recording a friend of, a fellow YCT graduate, and he said, oh, I have a biblical drinking game. I said, great, let's do an episode on that. So we start drinking, we start recording. And then towards the end of that, somehow we both share that our favorite book in Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, is Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I don't know about you, Rachel, or your listeners, but it is typically not considered people's favorite book of the entirety of the Bible. And I'm not saying it's obscure, but it just doesn't usually meet, people's top 10 lists, let alone favorite. So we both instantly connected over that. And then one thing led to another. We said, you know what, let's just cut a new episode right now. So we created a whole other episode where we talk, and I happen to have been in the mindset fall of 2019 to write something on drinking in the book of Ecclesiastes. So I was incredibly familiar with it, and we went for it because drinking in the Bible, certain books, it pops up from time to time. For instance, Proverbs, drinking occurs there, but it's not a main piece of it. Drinking occurs in Genesis a few times, pretty big, but not the biggest thing. In certain other books, it might feature more prominently. The book of Ecclesiastes, it actually it performs actually a very important role in that book, and part of really what the author is going towards. And it's obviously very felicitous. It's very enjoyable. And so that, I think, was entirely unscripted, but it was something I was very passionate about. I think it's my favorite book in the entirety of the Jewish Bible, as well as it actually has a certain role and importance in something that I don't think people typically consider, A, within Jewish thought, and B, within the book of Ecclesiastes more broadly. So that would be my number one. I've had some other episodes. There have been lots of different ones. I mean, I was very excited when Adam Montefiore, the Jerusalem Post wine writer, reached out to me. He said, I'm enjoying your content. You haven't done anything on the modern history of Israel's wine, history. So I said, oh, okay. And it just turned into 2 separate episodes, which you already referenced that episode. It's incredibly insightful. A lot of stuff that we just don't even think about. Even people who live in Israel or like drinking Israeli wine, a lot to consider. So there's been a lot.
There's a lot. We can keep people busy who have not yet experienced your podcast. Keep them busy for quite a long time. I have been enjoying it. I'm going to continue to enjoy it, and I hope that this will also be an opportunity, perhaps, to introduce you to some new audience. I highly recommend checking out Drew Kaplan and the Jewish Drinking Show. It's been a real pleasure to have you here as a guest on my new podcast, Dram and Drash, here in the first season. And so I'm going to raise my glass one more time and say thank you for joining me. L'chaim.
Absolutely. L'chaim indeed. L'chaim.
Well, thank you for joining us again this month for a Dram and a Drash. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation with Rabbi Drew Kaplan. As always, all of the information about him, his website, and his podcast will be in the notes that go with the episode. If you're enjoying, please do subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. If you're watching the YouTube video, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and spread the word. If you're enjoying a Dram and a Drash, spread the word to family and friends so they can enjoy it too. And also, please, I would love to hear from you. Leave your feedback, your comments, write a review for the podcast. And if you happen to be a Jewish professional who enjoys a dram, please be in touch. I'd love to hear from you. And if you are a whiskey professional who happens to be Jewish, I would love to talk to you as well, as we plan for future episodes and future seasons of a Dram and a Drash. But for now, thank you and l'chaim.